Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clementi, retired FBI profiler and former New York City prosecutor and current producer and writer on Criminal Minds. And today with me is...
Laura Richards. I'm criminal behavioural analyst. I'm also co-founder and director of Paladin, the National Stalking Advocacy Service, and author of the DASH Risk Model.
And I'm Lisa Zambetti. I am the casting director for Criminal Minds, where I work with Jim. He writes and I cast for killers, victims, and everything in between. And it's so good to have the band back together.
Yeah,
Laura's
welcome back, Laura.
Thank you. I had a great time in London. It was pretty busy.
Made a lot of progress against people who would stalk and commit violence against people and women in particular.
Absolutely. And, we're very grateful to Lily Allen for speaking out. And I spent, a lot of time thinking about her situation and her case, and it was very brave for her to speak out. And of course, that then led to a number of other issues in terms of what the police said to her, saying that she put other victims at risk, which is utter nonsense. She was very brave speaking out on Newsnight about it. So unless people do stand up and have advocates who help them understand the system, people get lost and they get silenced.
Yeah. That article is on our Facebook page if you want to. If you're not familiar with what Laura's talking about, Lily Allen is a singer. Yeah?
She is. She's a big singer in the UK. Has released quite a lot of hits, and although she's been quiet for a while, she's been juggling and managing lots of different things. But she was stalked for 7 years, and in fact, the stalker is just about to come up for sentencing. So we really hope that the courts do understand stalking and certainly the things that she was saying, because he did threaten to kill her, and we believe that was a clear intention. And like I said, it's been going on for 7 years. It's not just what he was charged with, which I think was about 6 weeks of behaviour. So.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems, and that's one of the issues that Laura has been fighting so hard to change the laws on, that people, particularly in law enforcement and the justice system, actually look at this crime like it is. It's a whole confluence of behavior. It's events that go on and on and on, and many of them are very insidious, very subtle, but they're very threatening at the same time.
Yeah, and it's that drip, 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 and she certainly was fearful. And when he was making threats, his family were actually calling the police, feeling that he would actually act on this, and fearful for Lily herself. And yet, although she was collecting all the evidence, she was doing all the right things, unfortunately the police weren't listening to her. So in the end she had to hire a lawyer, which she said, other people couldn't afford to do that. So we really want to make sure, he hasn't been charged with stalking, incidentally, and that's one of the key things. If you're not charged with stalking and put before the courts as a stalker, it can be missed. So we've also been campaigning for longer sentences for stalkers, for it to be increased from the 5-year term to a 10-year term, so that people can be treated at the same time. If they're not safe enough, they have to go to prison, that they're treated whilst they're in prison. So
you have that very chilling, you coined that phrase, murder in slow motion, in your article. That's just terrifying.
The more murders I review, and of course we've been talking about Nicole and Ron, but sadly I've reviewed more cases since, and we had a case in the UK of Anna Marie Birch, who was stalked, and she reported 9 times to police, and he was hiding in her garden and laying in wait for her, and she was terrified, and yet there was still no proactive action. So for me, these are murders in slow motions. They're the only types of cases and crimes, actually, domestic violence and stalking, where we have the opportunity to intervene and prevent serious harm and homicide. So we really do need people, professionals, whether you're a police officer, whether you're a lawyer, an advocate, whether you work in housing or the health service, to sit up and start to take these things seriously, because people are being murdered in proportions that it would be a pandemic. If men were dying in the same rate, I'm sure it would be looked at and questioned, and certainly when we know it's 2 women every week in the UK who are murdered by an ex-partner, and it's 3 women every day in the US and 1 woman every day in South Africa. So it's a global issue. It's not just about the UK, as we all know.
Yeah, those are terrible statistics, and thank you for raising the awareness and also fighting so hard to change the laws. Hopefully the US will follow suit, and we will have stronger laws and stronger follow-up when somebody actually complains about being stalked or being the victim of domestic violence.
As in that last one, Jim, of domestic violence, the UK's just had our first conviction, actually, and sentence for coercive control. And of course, when we talked about Nicole in these cases, a lot of the times we're talking about coercive control before anything physical happens. So we've just seen our first sentence, and a particular offender called Anwar had coercively controlled his partner, someone called Gemma Doherty, and he got 28 months. And, such was the detail of this coercion. He would control everything she ate, what she wore, how literally every part of her life was micromanaged by him, and he wanted her to look a certain way. And she was so coercively controlled and brainwashed that even when police were called, when she was physically assaulted, she actually told them she liked and enjoyed being beaten. And actually it was the police officers who turned around and said, this isn't right. And that's sort of the journey of discovery we're training our police officers on.
Luckily,
to ask the
they
right questions.
were well trained. They did know how to assess the risk. They did listen to you. They did listen to the dash. And they actually stepped in a case where this woman had been so controlled she couldn't see the forest for the trees.
And the good news is, she says that she's now got her life back, and she can't sort of equate what happened to her and who she was to now having her freedom and her liberty. So people can escape these abusive situations, and they can escape with the help of professionals to leave safely. So that's the up note on this, and that's exactly what the advocacy service Paladin, and other advocacy services across the globe here in the US do to work with victims and to help them leave safely and to hold the offender to account.
Right, and that's a perfect segue into the topic today, and actually the topic maybe for the next couple of episodes of Real Crime Profile. We're going to do sort of a wrap-up on the OJ case and talk about the civil case, and also talk about who we think really killed Nicole and Ron. We talked a lot about the Dream Team or the Scheme Team, but some of the major players on the other side are Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, and of course Judge Ito. Marcia was definitely articulate, smart, and very experienced at trying these kinds of cases under somewhat different circumstances, but trying these kinds of cases. But she looked very depressed. I think she was being personally attacked.
I mean, we don't just think, we know Jim. I mean,
Yeah.
Jim C, she was totally being attacked on every front and undermined in every way possible. So that is going to take a toll, no matter how strong you are as a professional or how good you are at your job. It will take its toll.
Yeah, and I think it did take its toll. And the overall depiction in this show of Marcia Clark was decent, but I don't think it really gave any kind of commentary about how ridiculous it was that she was treated way differently than all of the other attorneys on this case, every single one of them without exception. And that's wrong. It was because she was a woman.
But having said that it would absolutely have an impact on somebody, no matter how good a professional you are, I think we can't overlook the fact that there were some fundamentally flawed decisions that were made on behalf of the prosecution. And, we did talk about, yes, they lost their lead prosecutor, but the decisions that they took with, for example, putting Furman on the stand, which led to a complete distraction. We're going to talk about some of the things that the civil trial, that the plaintiff attorney learned from the criminal trial, because I think that's important. But they didn't, in terms of the glove demo, some of the forensics. Well, actually, having read some of the things, more articles recently, I think it's interesting that there were lots of other things that weren't tested or presented as evidence at the trial. And one of those things, which I thought was very interesting, was an empty Swiss Army knife box that was found actually in O.J. Simpson's bathroom. And Furman and others did criticise her post-trial about why that wasn't ever entered into evidence, along with the polygraph test that he failed, along with, I think it was the police taped interview with O.J. Simpson, the Bronco chase, the suicide notes, all these things.
Right.
We don't know why.
Yeah, the polygraph test can't be entered into evidence unless the defense actually agrees. So both sides have to agree. So it would be unlikely that could come in. But Swiss Army knives are notoriously known for being incredibly sharp. And so they can actually very well be used as a murder weapon. They're easy to hide. They're easy to dispose of. So I agree. That's something that absolutely should have been done. But the scheme team started right from the start. And I think they pushed for a rapid trial so that the prosecution wouldn't be very well prepared. And they, on the other hand, had a number of different law firms represented, and they had all that that work. All those people were focused on this one trial. And I think it made a difference because they were able to prepare. They only have to make an innuendo about evidence or a theory or whatever. They don't have to prove anything. The prosecution.
Sowing a seed.
Yes.
Sowing a seed.
They did a good job of it and basically created incredibly difficult circumstances for the prosecution.
And being outgunned, I mean, there is one other point about the preparation because, when I was thinking back, and I was saying to Lisa, it was just interesting when you were watching the People versus A.J. Simpson that some test results were coming in whilst they were at trial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can't remember one case where that has happened. Normally you have all your results back, etc. And of course you're putting that together in your case preparation and you've got to submit what you're going to enter into evidence. But there just seemed this sense of them not being prepared.
Is that a sign of the times, though? I mean, do you think it was slower to get those results in?
I think the tests take longer, but no, I think this is the thing. This is the error they made. Instead of going after him first, prosecuting him for fleeing, and I think they should have done that. Once they arrested him, they should have done that. They should have taken A.C. Cowling. They should have taken him into custody, charged him with attempting to aid.
As they said they would do.
As they said they would, a fleeing felon or a fleeing fugitive. And instead of doing that, they went full force on the murder trial way before they were ready to do that. But in this case, because they were sort of forced by the circumstances to go to trial faster on it than they would normally have wanted to for a trial this magnitude, they basically did not have all their ducks in a row. And it was clear as a result of, the result of the trial shows that they were not ready.
Well, it certainly had an impact on the outcome. And I think when we compare the civil trial and what happened, I think that becomes staggeringly clear.
Yes. So then the next attorney was Christopher Darden. And I said, just based on what I remember from him during the original trial and how he was portrayed and some of the verbatim quotes that they talked about, or they had the actors replay. He was a very honest and respectful guy, but I think he was very emotional, and certainly by the end of this trial or somewhere, maybe even by the beginning of the trial, he was very disillusioned. There are rules, and there's honor, and there's ethics, and they try to live by those. And when they just time and time again see defense attorneys getting away with not following the rules and not having any ethics or morals, that they find it very difficult that the judge doesn't call them out on it. And I think that was the case in this trial.
With Cochran, who was pretty much running Judge Ito and the court.
He certainly was, from inside and outside the courtroom. I actually met a guy from who was in the prosecutor's office at that time and worked behind the scenes. Was not on the actual trial team, but worked on the case behind the scenes. And he said, "Yeah, we generally loved Judge Ito. Well, maybe generally, but he really screwed this case up."
Well, you might not be the only one who's blaming him. Just looking at what people do say, and certainly I think he retired last year, didn't he?
He had a long career. He's one of the few people involved on that side of it that continued to work.
Yeah.
Do you think it was much more about had it not have been televised, there would be different decisions and potentially a different outcome?
I think so, yeah, because the responding to things that were happening in the public rather than controlling his courtroom so that it didn't matter what was going on in public, or that the people in his courtroom didn't influence things that were going on in the public. How is it that Johnny Cochran can talk about a motion that's before the judge out on the unconscionable, and Ito, instead of recognizing it for what it was, bent over backwards for Johnny one more time?
Hello, it's Jim Clementi and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
It was interesting, there was a jury consultant who did extensive survey research, particularly about the O.J. Simpson case and how it changed what Americans thought about the criminal justice system and certainly trial lawyers. And the overwhelming conclusion was that trial lawyers were sleazy and, were tricksters and were playing games. And also they concluded that those who didn't play the game and pull the stunts were lousy lawyers.
Yeah, it's like, you can't have it both ways. Actually, it was the other way around. If you're playing games, if you're doing stunts, this is the justice system. It should be taken very seriously, and the honor code should be followed. And I don't think that happened at all on the defense side. They deliberately made moves, and we've talked about it in other episodes about lies and deliberate misleading the court, as well as misleading the public. Lisa and I talked about jury system earlier. I spoke to a career prosecutor this week, and he's retired now, but it's so funny because he said, this is the analogy he made. What we ask a jury to do is like saying, you're going to a realtor, right? You want to buy a house. You're going to spend $400, $500, whatever, hundreds of thousands of dollars on a house. And the person shows you the house. You're not allowed to ask a single question. You barely take any notes. You can't, if there's anything, that you see or hear or whatever, you can't comment on it. But it may be 9 months later that you're supposed to make a decision on this house without having asked a single question. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. The jury system was built at a time when trials were very simple. They lasted hours, not days, weeks, months, or even years. They had no incredibly complicated science or sophisticated legal concepts that had to be explained in detail to the jury. And he, after having served a career as a prosecutor, he was really disgusted at how now, today, it's so much more difficult to get somebody convicted because of the CSI effect and because of how we now treat a jury like they are incredibly capable of keeping millions of minute details about people's behavior and about the trial and about all the evidence, that they're able to keep that in their head and then later deliberate about it. What do you do in London? Do you have the same kind of juries? Or...
Have you been on a jury, Laura?
I haven't. Funnily enough, I just got my jury summons through, and I would have really enjoyed, the experience in the sense of seeing it from a different side. But unfortunately, because my timings in terms of where I was travelling to and from, it didn't work. So it's been bound over. There was a time when you worked in the Metropolitan Police Service, whether you were police staff or whether you were a police officer, where you actually couldn't do jury service. I assume that the same
Yeah,
here,
you can get called in for jury duty. You will never get picked. It's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm still interested to go through that process because you talked about it as well, didn't you?
Yes.
And I think it would be, very, very interesting. I've certainly sat in on, a number of high-profile cases at the Old Bailey, and certainly, our court system is very different, in many senses. And of course, I think the OJ trial had very much of almost like a reality TV feel to it. Where, in most cases you're going through really dry detail that's quite difficult to understand and hear at times. But I think, most people's, from lots of TV shows, not just the OJ trial, but think it's, what we see on our TVs all the time, that it's exciting and there are these, kind of dramatic moments in court where rarely is it like that. And of course, Oscar Pistorius, whenever I think about just televised trials in particular, I think about, of course, OJ, but the Oscar Pistorius case, which was televised, and
we'll
people
definitely
have the
get to
opportunity.
that shortly.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and people have the opportunity to see, how the system works and just the level of detail, but certainly globally, how the systems are so different. And the South African system is so different, from the UK. I found it very difficult to understand, decisions that were being made. in that context. And the same in some senses. I felt the OJ, when we reflect back on it, was much more like a reality TV show.
They want very clear roles. They want the good guy, the bad guy, the bitch, the asshole. They want these very clear stereotypes.
Yeah, but they're looking at it as an entertainment, and that's what it isn't. And I don't know why we have to have live broadcasts of trials. I think, one, it violates the victim's right to privacy. Let's say Bill Cosby gets arrested for serial rape, right? Are we really going to put cameras in so that every victim has to get up there and tell the horrific details of what happened to them?
Well, I mean, they would have special measures, but of course we know that it's the victims that are put on trial, and it's them that people are, judging and blaming rather than the perpetrator. And in fact, we see that all the time. In one of our high-profile cases, a young girl called Amélie Delagrange, and then Marsha McDonnell and Kate Sheedy were all attacked by one man, Levi Belfield, and the Metropolitan Police Service were very quick, within 3 months, to arrest and charge him. Actually, it took far longer to charge, but and it went to trial 3 years later. But it then came out that he was charged with the attempted or the abduction and the murder of a young girl called Millie Dowler. And when that case went to trial separately, it was the family that were put on trial. And I still think our justice system, certainly in the UK, and certainly when we think about the case with Nicole and Ron, they were the ones that were put on trial in the sense that they were discredited, as was LAPD put on trial, and Furman, and all the other things, rather than the actual perpetrator.
Right.
And it put in the context that it was a domestic violence murder. I still think it's staggering that, when we think back 20 years ago, 150 million people tuned in to their TVs to watch at the moment when the verdict was returned. I mean, that is huge in terms of numbers.
Yeah, and it's almost as big a number as the DNA ruled out anybody but OJ to 170 million people. I mean, that's everybody that lives in the United States on the west side of the Mississippi. Probably much more than that, actually, because the East Coast is much more densely populated. But, I mean, those are staggering numbers, and yet he walked free. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But when you mention the victim being on trial, I'll mention it now, but I'll also mention it at the end. There's a great documentary called Valentine Road. And it's about a young boy who was murdered in his class, basically executed in a classroom in front of his classmates by one of his classmates. And I don't want to give away everything, but the fact is it's a tremendously moving documentary, and I would recommend it to everybody. One of the things that I wanted to add to, after discussing with this prosecutor, my good friend Keith Warburton, he had also been in the FBI with Jim Fitzgerald and I when we started in the FBI, but then he went back to becoming a prosecutor. One of the things that I was talking was that a jury should be more like a community review board, where there are members of the different professions, but there are also members of the public. So I think it needs to be balanced, and I think that if there are professionals who understand there can be an expert from the defense side and from the prosecution side and one neutral expert. But the fact is that there has to be a way to make sure that what the jurors are doing in that room is right. They're not doing experiments. They're not putting pressure on people because of race or emotion or something else, and that they're actually considering the evidence and not just making an emotional decision.
So are you saying that those professionals would vote in the verdict, or they're just observing and being there to ask questions or make sure people are understanding things correctly?
I think the review board people would be there to observe, and to be able to answer questions. The experts, I thought, would be there to answer the questions. The review board would be to make sure that everybody's following the right procedure. So I think that, just having 12 people in a room free to do and say whatever they want, and to consider or not consider everything that was actually presented to them, it just seems like a very antiquated thing that it's a fallacy, and yet we're letting them make these decisions. And especially after watching Valentine Road, because they did have at least 3 of the jurors interviewed afterwards to tell what they believed happened or why they made their decisions, and I was speechless hearing them. It was unbelievable. But anyway, I'd like to hear from the listeners and what they think after they see that movie.
So I think we're going to turn now directly to the civil trial and talk about the differences in that outcome and the process. Somebody, I was reading a couple articles about this, and somebody was saying that it's like, you watch a dress rehearsal and it makes the next performance a lot easier. And it seems like that is indeed what happened in this case.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different reasons why the case and the outcome were different in the civil trial from the criminal trial. One being hindsight. They had the benefit of seeing what worked and what didn't work, but also the differences between civil and criminal cases. So criminal cases, we all know that the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that doesn't mean beyond any doubt, like that there can't be a single doubt, but it has to be a reasonable doubt. And that just means it's sort of a term of art, and nobody can actually define it, but you sort of know it when you see it. That's how it's actually used. But in civil cases, the standard is a preponderance of the evidence. And that's somewhere in between probable cause, which is 51%. More likely than not is probable cause. And beyond a reasonable doubt is probably 95 or 98%. And so preponderance of the evidence is somewhere in between. And you can't really put your finger on it, but it means that most of the evidence points to the person's guilt and or responsibility in this matter. And so that's not the only thing that's different. What's also different is that they get to do depositions in advance. And for people who haven't been through this, depositions are, incredibly time-consuming process for the lawyers who have to prepare for them and actually do the deposition. And it's incredibly stressful for the people who are undergoing it, because you have to remember all these little details and understand where the questions are going. And many times they will do things in depositions that will try to sort of trick you into agreeing to something that does not have all the facts involved, and therefore kind of manipulates what your testimony is.
It's videotaped, and there's no going back once you say something.
So once you say something in a deposition, you're basically locked into that statement. Otherwise, when you get on the stand, they're going to use that statement against you. It's sworn testimony when you do a deposition. So it's actually a dress rehearsal for the trial. So in civil cases, it's actually easier to understand what's actually coming into evidence and what witnesses are actually going to say on the stand. And because of that, there's a lot more prep before the trial, but once the trial happens, it is basically a show for the trier of fact, the judge and or the jury. So I think that those are two major differences between the civil case and the criminal trial that preceded it.
Well, and I think the other thing is that obviously the criminal charge was first-degree murder, wasn't it? And with first-degree murder, as you mentioned, you've got to show intention, that it was intentional and premeditated.
Premeditated, yeah.
And we're going to talk about that when we get to Oscar Pistorius as well, and Reva, because it's the same thing, that comes up and issues that come up with that. But for the civil trial, it's wrongful. The charge was wrongful death, and they have to prove that it's intentional and that it's unlawful conduct that results in the death. So I think one of the key differences as well with the criminal and the civil trial was that the jury were predominantly black in the criminal trial, although it wasn't exclusively black, and the same can be said of the civil trial. Again, predominantly white, but again, there were others from other races on that trial. But perhaps that also had a bearing.
Yeah. Well, given the fact that Ito allowed the defense to create an issue out of race and to stir up emotions in the community, and those emotions Ito, I'm sure, was influenced by because he was afraid of a riot, and the security had to be beefed up over and over and over again over the course of this trial, and especially for the decisions, the verdict. I think that it's very clear, and all the players in it knew that race was being played in that case. But the judge in the civil case did what he was supposed to do and said, look, we're not going to focus on that. We're going to move forward with the evidence.
So this is Judge Fujisaki, who definitely was no nonsense. He told them on both sides he's not going to tolerate any of these courtroom shenanigans. Yeah, so he locked that down right off the jump.
So he learned, too, from Ito's mistakes. And I think that really was why you had a very smooth-running trial. There weren't any riots. There weren't any distractions. And guess what? I don't think there were any cameras in there. The differences between the two trials were dramatic and plenty. I think, number one, they didn't call Furman, so they were able to avoid, in great measure, the stain on the image of the LAPD. Judge Ito was not part of it, and his bending over backwards and his allowing grandstanding and celebrity worship to go on. I thought one thing that was interesting was that they did not call Denise Brown to the stand. That was interesting to me because they apparently had made some judgment that people didn't believe her when she took the stand and cried. That seems a little weird. I mean, she's the family member of one of the victims.
I guess that's a very subjective test, but it seemed that they were making quite critical decisions about who they would call and who they wouldn't. And even the fact that they called Robert Kardashian, and actually his deposition was really important because they actually used it against OJ. So maybe they felt that they had enough in terms of the people that they would call, and were going to be very careful about those that they couldn't and wouldn't know whether it would have a positive or negative impact. But Robert Kardashian basically said that yes, OJ Simpson was very worried after the 1989 assaults and was worried that the police were coming after him. Whereas when OJ was giving his deposition and Petrocelli was asking him whether he had ever assaulted or abused Nicole, he kept saying no, he hadn't.
Right.
But Robert Kardashian had already shown him out as a liar.
Right. And yeah, he had said that, OJ had said that he didn't know the police were looking for him on that issue. And in fact, Kardashian said, yeah, he told me about it when it was happening. So that's reliable because it happened at the time. It's an admission against interest and so forth.
And you probably know Jim C, as a prosecutor yourself. I know I was talking to one recently in London, and he's a phenomenal prosecutor, someone called Brian Altman. And when I asked him certain questions about how he's never lost a trial at the Old Bailey, he's always said to me, there's battles and wars, Laura. And you've got to choose where, as we all know, that some things, you think it might be helpful, but actually is it going to take you much further forward? So I think there was very careful selection from Petrocelli, who, was absolutely focused around ensuring this was heard as a domestic violence murder, and then all the evidence and the people that they called to reinforce that, as well as the fact that when he basically took O.J. Simpson apart when he gave his evidence, and I think he did from what I can see and read and understand, he did a fantastic job.
Yeah, can you just tell the listeners what the Old Bailey is?
So the Old Bailey is the Central Criminal Court in London. So it's near St Paul's. It's where all of our very high-profile cases are heard, whether it's terrorism or murder. I've been there numerous times to listen to different cases that I've had involvement on. And it's really where you get to see some of the most complex cases tried.
Mm-hmm. Wow, and he's undefeated there.
He's undefeated, which is, an amazing feat. He was the senior Treasury Counsel, and he got his silk whilst he was prosecuting the first case against Levi Belfort.
What's his silk? What's that?
So those who may not know what silk is, that's to enable him to become, for him to become Queen's Counsel. So it's called a QC, where you go to the bar. Have you not seen the TV show Silk?
No.
It's another British drama. Some people think it's great.
Is that the robe they wear, the hair they wear?
What is
it? Yeah, it's their traditional dress, silk, in terms of the gown and the wig. And, they are Queen's Counsels, barristers, and he is probably the leading criminal barrister, I would say, in the UK. And when I've had the opportunity to listen to him, he just astounds me with his courtcraft, and he is relentless on the cross-examination, and he traps people in their own lies, and it is lethal. But he is the most personal person outside of court, which is why it's such an interesting...
Sounds like our next show, to tell you the truth.
He could be a show.
Yeah, there you go. So another thing that came in during the civil trial that didn't come in the criminal trial was that Nicole had called a shelter a few days before her death, frantic because she was so scared of OJ. All right, that's important.
So there's a clear sign, as we keep saying, victim's perception of risk of serious harm and homicide, and there we have Nicole saying she's terrified and being terrorized.
Yes. Then, of course, there's the Bruno Magli shoes that OJ denied owning, and actually what happened, Laura?
Yeah, well, these are the bloody footprints, which I think, is interesting. It intrigued me why this wasn't heard at the criminal trial. Maybe you know why that is, Jim. Maybe they didn't have the evidence turned around at that point. But I think the shoes are, fundamental to the case, or the footprints, I should say, that 2 sets were found, according to Dr. Henry Lee.
Right.
One being a size 10, and then I think it's a 10.5, and the other being these size 12 Bruno Magli shoe footprints. And at the time when O.J. Simpson's asked about them, and he's actually asked, do you own a pair? And he says, no, he doesn't, and, he would never have worn those ugly arse shoes, quote.
Right.
And I think beforehand, before the trial actually came about, because I think a statement had been made to that effect, but the Petrocelli had in his hands over 30 pictures of him wearing those shoes.
Yeah, at sports events and on TV, for everybody to see. Now, the important thing about those shoes was that they're an extremely rare brand of shoes. They're handmade. They're very, very expensive, and they only sell a few of them every year. And
but there's only 299 pairs of Bruno Magli shoes in that size that have ever been sold in the US.
Ever.
And only 9% of the US population wears a size 12. So it basically means it's not a common shoe.
No, it's not common at all. And yet he was wearing them so many times, and he lied about them, which again is an indicator of guilt, right? One of the things that they did bring up in the civil trial was that, quote, an FBI agent had a picture of the victim's family on his desk. And they brought that out as a bias. And I laugh at that. That's ridiculous. Of course, law enforcement is going to be interested in solving the crime and bringing justice to the victim's family. They are the victim of a crime. That's the one thing that nobody can deny. They're the crime victim's family, right? The Justice Department, which the FBI is part of, the entire justice system is geared at addressing victimization, at bringing justice to the people who did it. So to say that means he was biased, well, I'm sorry. If he is law enforcement, he is biased to find out the truth of what happened for the victims. I think that was just sort of a grandstanding moment that was really absurd in my mind.
I think it's just interesting, that exchange, though. I mean, just to go back to OJ and how he kind of presents, because I've seen this with a lot of offenders, that, the challenge goes in about, has he ever bought a pair of the shoes? And he says no. And OJ then says, I know that Bruno Magli makes shoes that look like those shoes that they had in court that's involved with this case, but I would never have worn those ugly ass shoes. And then Petrocelli presses him some more to elaborate on why he thinks they're ugly. And he basically turns around and says that it's the look of them, I don't like the style of them, they're ugly to me. Aesthetically, I felt that they were ugly, and I guess beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and to me they were ugly shoes. Petrocelli then shows him a picture
right.
of him wearing those Bruno Magli shoes 9 months before the murder, and he then obfuscates as to whether it's him. He says it might be him. He doesn't remember
whether it's him in the
picture.
It's him in the picture, not if it's the shoes.
Exactly, and whether somebody's superimposed.
I've seen these pictures. I mean, that's ridiculous.
There's
no doubt that it's him.
But he says this without any shame, without any kind of embarrassment, with any kind of backpedaling or anything else. He just delivers it in a very cool and calm and convincing way. And it's that plausibility, it's that lack of anxiety that we see in terms of certainly psychopaths, those people who have no ability to feel, remorse or shame or empathy, and the way that he delivers it. And I think the fact that he, over his days of deposition, he evades and obfuscates the whole time. And even when he's caught in a lie, he just carries on regardless.
Yeah, but I think Petrocelli said after that he would rather lie than eat. I mean, he can't.
He
He knows nothing else.
Right.
Yeah. The other major difference between the civil trial and this criminal trial is that the civil trial had an entire theme of domestic violence, where they actually told the story of how they, over the years, the 17 years that they had been together and known each other.
The context of
yes,
it. Yeah.
They put it in context, and they basically painted an incredibly vivid picture of this, even through OJ's own words and his false denials. I mean, the fact that he could sit up there on the stand and deny ever beating her in the face of all this overwhelming evidence, and the fact that she had, 8 or 9 times had called the police because of his violence towards her.
He obfuscates on each point. I mean, that went on, that whole constant questioning of, lack of direct answer went on for a period of time where he just kept going round and round the houses of saying different things, but never directly answering the question. Classic tactics of diversion and distraction.
He is charismatic. He does know how to command a room. He is very charming, and everybody wants to like him. But at the same time, you can't be blind to the fact that he was not answering the questions. He was evading things. He couldn't explain why there was so much evidence that he committed the crime, other than the fact that he was lying about it. It's an amazing display of just how some human beings do not care what other people think about them, and because of that, they're not really restrained the way that normal people are.
You're saying whether they care or don't care, but how about if they don't have the capacity? They cannot care, and therefore they're not interested in caring, because actually if it's not derived and it's not in their own self-interest, then, and that's when we understand when people have, low emotional empathy levels or no empathy at all. And I think with OJ, for me, looking at everything, the analysing all of the behaviour, all of the material that we've seen, reading everything, watching everything in terms of the trials, for me, he has no empathy, no remorse, no attunement or attachment. Everything's driven by his own self-interest, high levels of narcissism. So what am I describing now?
Psychopathy?
Absolutely. And, he's off the scale in terms of being able to manipulate people.
Yeah, and that's normal for a psychopath, right? Glib and charismatic, and just being able to just wow everybody, and having, having this sort of thrill-seeking behavior where their lives are so exciting, everything's great, you just draw people in and people want to be around you. And clearly Nicole was suffering from that. She wanted to be part of his life. She was thrilled. She was 18 years old when she met him. And he sort of swept her off her feet and made her life much more interesting.
He totally did. I mean, that's...
Yeah, and that would have been great if he wasn't a psychopath, if he wasn't this guy prone to rage. And
with his fearless dominance. I mean, that's the other thing we see, with psychopathy, and having been reading a lot of Professor James Fallon's work recently, this kind of fearless dominance that people show. And I think that's exactly what O.J. Simpson has shown us and revealed about his character. And, he genuinely doesn't feel these things. He has no remorse, and he has aggressive narcissism. And we'll talk a bit about psychopathy, because there's some recommendations I want to make at the end of this, but I think that it's an interesting sort of chapter on its own, isn't it, to talk about when we're talking about people like O.J. Simpson and Oscar Pistorius and the cases that we're going to be analysing and profiling and dissecting. So the other thing, just to state the obvious in many senses, just about the criminal and the civil trial, was obviously in the criminal, we know that O.J. Simpson was acquitted, and in the civil trial, he was found liable of those deaths. And two things to say about that. Well, one was that the jury, I believe they deliberated for 4 hours, including lunch, in the criminal trial. but for the civil trial, they actually deliberated for 5 days.
That's right.
So we know that they went through and they tested and they discussed and they questioned and they did read back and play back in the civil trial lots of the evidence and debated it.
Right, and although only 9 of the 12 had to actually vote for his liability, all 12 of them voted for his liability. They were unanimous that he was liable for their deaths. So I think that tells you that, 1, they took their responsibility seriously, and 2, they didn't let none of the shenanigans that went on. I mean, the completely irresponsible act of a jury after 9 months of hearing testimony actually spending 2 hours or less deliberating. I mean, to me, that's unconscionable, and it really slaps the face of the victims in this case, the people that were brutally murdered that should have gotten justice.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing to say about it was that, one is that, this is probably the closest that we'll ever get to him being found guilty, in a civil trial of murder. But also simultaneously with the civil trial was also the custody trial for Justin and Sydney, the children who, of course, we haven't really mentioned or spoken about. But it really made me wonder, as he's going between these 2 trials and he's successful and gets custody in the custody trial, but how does that impact on the children? They go back to Rockingham, he goes home, he's been found liable, i.e. he's been held responsible for the murders, and how does that happen? How do they carry on living knowing what that means effectively?
Well, I don't know how much they do know about that, or whether they just listen to his spin. Obviously during the criminal trial, he tried to say, my kids haven't seen me in all these months and all that, and but just how irresponsible is the court to put a man back in control of 2 little children when it's been demonstrated in both courts that he has been violent to
Nicole,
their
mother.
mother. Yeah.
So he's an abusive parent. In the Netherlands, for example, if there's any abuse, if it's going through a custodial or child contact process, if there's any abuse, they're deemed to be not a good enough parent. And that doesn't necessarily happen in the UK, but he has been shown to be violent and abusive. And so to give Sydney and Justin, give him full custody of them, kind of flies in the face.
And you think that the custody hearing would have to wait until after the civil hearing, right?
You would think so, but I know they do run, certainly in the UK, as very separate processes. Certainly if there's a criminal trial, it runs totally separately from what might be heard in a civil trial or family court trial.
If we could talk about children who are the survivors of domestic abuse in their families, or survivors of abuse themselves, I mean, we need to really talk about.
I think it's important to talk about the children, absolutely, and certainly there was a study by Black, I think it was in 1975, so we're going back in time, but certainly in the 70s, that showed that when there were murders committed within the home, that I believe it was a statistic, something like 75% of children were sat on the stairs or actually heard it. It's just that law enforcement didn't necessarily ask them whether they heard it. And of course, there's the actual homicide event itself and the impact that they lose both parents, but it's also about the lead up to that when there's abuse, because it is a pattern of behaviour that's happening. They will be not necessarily subjected to it directly, but certainly indirectly. And we know certainly children will get in the way and try and protect, and that will have a profound impact on children, and particularly when we think about psychopathy, down the line of children who are being exposed to violence in a 3-dimensional way, it has an impact, and it has an impact on their brain development.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, yes, it's sad if they lose both their parents. That is a tragedy, but we have the entire foster system is based on the fact that if somebody is in a bad or violent or abusive situation, that it's damaging to the child, risky to the child, and therefore we take them away from their parents or their parent and put them in another family, and hopefully they're going to get love and caring from whoever is that family. And certainly in this case, there were grandparents, there were sisters.
Yeah, there's a lot of extended family who could have taken.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so
the grandparents had them, didn't they? And Nicole's parents actually had them, and they were trying to give them as normal an upbringing at that time. But what is normal when something like this happens? There's no such thing.
Yeah.
But I'm sure the impact on them when they go back to Rockingham and their father's being found liable, and of course what they're exposed to externally, whether maybe the media's controlled, etc., and what they're exposed to, but certainly I could imagine the atmosphere in the house must have been very strange for them, and their upbringing going forward, then put into different schools, and the uprooting, and what do they say and understand of it, and people around them, that you're the children of Nicole, and this incredibly notorious case. How does that impact on their future development, psychosocial and attunement and attachment themselves?
And OJ's decision to move to Florida so that he could basically avoid the judgment, so that he didn't have to pay the vast majority of the money that he owed. Uprooting them, taking them away from their other extended family and everything they've known.
What, for his own selfish needs, do you mean?
That's possible.
Self-interest, and that he is the person that matters, and the children, and that's exactly what we're talking about. Of whose interest, is it in, when the children kind of lose out in every respect? They lose their mother, but then he uproots them further because he's trying to game the system so that he doesn't have to pay any of the, 33 million?
Yeah, I wanted to get back to Petroselli's closing arguments for the punitive damages, which I actually read through the transcripts, and it took days to come to that amount because both sides were going back and forth on how much he was worth now, but he's not worth that much anymore because his because of this. It was very interesting reading. But anyway, Petroselli says, you must send him a message as loud as humanly possible so he can hear it on whatever golf course he's hiding on right now. You cannot kill two people and get away with it, no matter how much money you have, no matter how many lies you tell. I mean, that's just boom.
It's pretty powerful, yeah.
It's a symbol, well and truly, and the families all said that it was never about the money. They just want him held responsible. They want justice, in inverted commas. There's no such thing, we talked about no such thing as closure, but it is a symbol. And of course they're also thinking, the lawyers, I'm sure, about what his worth will be in the future, him writing books and movies, etc., etc.
But if you think about the desperation, I think that's one of the things they did depict very well in the actual dramatic series about OJ after the verdict, when Ron Goldman's sister turned to their dad and said, what do we do now? It was as if, how can we go on with life knowing that this guy's out, knowing that my brother and your son has been brutally murdered, and Nicole, and we can't do anything more about it. We can't hold him responsible. And so it was good. It was some measure of actually holding him responsible by going after him civilly. But of course, just as he always does, he danced around it and lied and did all his other things. But the truth will out, right?
Eventually.
Yeah.
And I always believe in that. The truth will eventually out. And, I think certainly it must have been hard for them going through that process again, hearing what happened to Nicole and Ron. But I think the civil trial was very interesting because when, I think it was Baker, the defence attorney, tried to discredit Ron by saying, well, he'd never have the restaurant that he dreamed of, he'd never have a credit card, and, Nicole was hanging around with prostitutes, that went down like a lead balloon.
Yeah, he was very tone deaf to what those words meant to that audience. He was no Johnny Cochran, let's put it that way.
So that certainly played in the plaintiff's favour, but it must have been very difficult for them going through that process again. And it's certainly working with families who are bereaved, whilst they're still in the fight and there's still something to hang on to, then they're highly motivated. But certainly following that process where Kim says, well, what do we do now? It's that feeling of they've not just been trying to fight for their son and daughter's memory to sort of be a legacy, but they're fighting a system as well. And when that fight stops, it is an emptiness of, well, how do you pick yourself back up and get up every morning when you haven't got a cause that's driving you each day forward?
Right. Yeah, it's like falling into an abyss, and I think it's just a testament to their strength that they stayed together, that they went on as a family and were able to make him be held responsible in the civil trial. And of course, shortly thereafter, or years thereafter, but OJ's stripes showed. And he was convicted of armed robbery. Just the arrogance and the ignorance and the arrogance of those actions. I think the judge in that case, in that criminal case, said that to OJ, to his face. But I believe he was stealing back memorabilia that he had to sell in part to satisfy this judgment. So in his mind, he probably rationalized it. Well, I should never have had to sell this stuff, so it's really my stuff. So it's okay if I take a gun and threaten people's lives and actually steal it back.
Well, in his mind, he's untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what's going on in his mind. He's managed to, it's like a car going off of a cliff, you know, in the criminal trial, that somehow in slow-mo this car is coming back to sit on top of the cliff. I mean, and he knows that fully well. And of course that just feeds his feeling, you know, he then goes through the custody trial and he wins that. He doesn't win the civil trial, but he maneuvers himself around the problem by going to Florida.
Yeah, he doesn't serve any time for that.
Doesn't serve any time for it, so what in his mind? So, you know, it might be seen as something that's reckless behaviour, but he just believes he's invincible, he's untouchable, and he's above the law. And you know what? In some senses, that's what happened. But
his money and his celebrity put him above the law.
yeah, he could do whatever he wanted. But of course, he is now behind bars, and he comes up for parole, is it next year?
Yeah.
Ooh.
2017, yeah.
The families again are put back under the pressure and, you know, the spotlight, and of course this show's put them back under the spotlight. And I do agree, you know, with Jim C, it's a testament to them of their strength, you know, setting up the foundations that they did, then going out delivering training, you know, all across the country, if not the globe, writing books, trying to get the right story out there. But I should imagine for them right now it feels very uncomfortable thinking this could all, you know, a game changer next year.
Right, so hopefully we, and by we I mean the people in this room and all the people that are listening to this, can actually do something about it, because we have some information to share about what we think actually went down that night and who was responsible for it. And perhaps there's a way to get OJ put in jail again.
This is news to me. Do you think that this could get him
We're going to talk about that in the next episode.
Oh, boy.
Not retried for that, but...
Interesting.
We do have a theory, and
yes.
you know, like with all these things, you know, the work that Jim and I do, you know, it has resonance in the real world. It's not just about, you know, talking on a podcast. These are people's lives that are at stake, whether it's our listeners who email us or tweet us because they're in a risky situation themselves and they need advice and support about how to you know, stay alive effectively. And we will come back to some of the questions that we've been asked, or whether it's real life cases that we're looking at that still have, you know, some of them are still live, where they do have serious repercussions in terms of, you know, future stakes, and Jim and I reviewing and looking at the evidence and reaching a conclusion as to where some of those potential lines of inquiry and future lines of investigation should be.
Please stay tuned to Real Crime Profile, because our next episode, we're going to be talking about our theory of what actually happened that night.
You're actually going to reveal your theory.
Absolutely.
Okay. You have any recs this week, guys? I know I do.
Yeah, I did have that one.
So you did the
documentary, Valentine Road, and it's a very powerful and disturbing documentary about a young boy who was murdered. And
it's by a fantastic guy called Eddie Schmidt,
yes,
who Jim and I recently met. And
because he's going to be the director, showrunner of Case Closed, a show that Laura and I are working on.
So watch this space. We will tell you more.
Yes.
So I'd like to give a recommendation. I've mentioned a little bit about psychopathy, and I've just been writing about it in my book. So I want to give a shout out to someone that Jim knows as well, someone called Professor James Fallon, and give a recommendation around his book called The Psychopath Inside, a neuroscientist's personal journey into the dark side of the brain. And I'm not going to say any more about it other than he doesn't just study this and do PET scans. He has intimate knowledge about how psychopaths behave and function, because much to his surprise, when he was running a PET scan study and an Alzheimer's test simultaneously, he had family members' brain scans on the desk, and he realised that one of them had pathological clear signs of pathology. And when he decided to take a decision to unblind the study, so he wanted to find out whose brain this scan belonged to in his family, he found out it was his own. And it's a fascinating read. But, if you don't get the book, have a look at his TED Talk, because it's really short and succinct. You can see what a fantastic storyteller he is. And it really just, for me, wraps up everything when I'm studying and analysing and profiling, and certainly writing my book on the murders of Amélie Delagrange and others, and joining up lessons around public protection. I think this really does give a clear insight into offenders, those who are psychopathic. So have a read or have a watch of the TED Talk.
Oh my God, that sounds fascinating. That sounds like a movie in itself.
It's an incredible story.
He's an amazing guy. I'm friends with him, and I've actually interviewed him once, and maybe one day we can bring him in. Sure. Do you have some?
Yeah, boy, there's so much that I'm watching right now that I would love to share with you. As Jim has said, Game of Thrones is on, Orphan Black is on, but I want to steer you guys off the beaten path a little bit to something that you may not know about. It's a little teeny tiny little indie film that I came across on Netflix. I had worked with this director and writer, Rupert Wyatt, years ago, and this was his first film. And if you like the recommendations we've made so far, I think you'll really like this film. It's called The Escapist, and it was shot in 2008, so a lot of people who are in it are now much more famous than they were then. There's a young Joseph Fiennes is in it, Brian Cox, Damian Lewis, and Liam Cunningham, who is in Game of Thrones. He plays, I forget the name of his character, but he's amazing in Game of Thrones. And this movie is about a bunch of convicts in jail who plot to escape. And it's just a fascinating little film. And Rupert went on to work with me and on Rise of the Planet of the Apes. So we went from this little teeny tiny film to working on a huge successful studio film, but you can see his genius in this little movie called The Escapist, and it's on Netflix right now. So I hope you'll check it out and let me know what you think.
Yeah, I came across that the other day.
You did?
Yeah, I didn't have time to watch it yet, but I definitely want to watch it. I was reading the description, and it sounded really good.
Really cool. It's really cool. So.
All right, sounds like we get the same recommendations on Netflix because we watch the same kind of things. Well, thank you all for listening. This has been great having the team back together again and getting into some real nitty-gritty details about the wrapping up of the O.J. case. Of course, next episode will have to do with our theory on what actually happened that night at Bundy.
So if you're a fan of the show and you want to help us out, there's a few things you can do. First, subscribe to the show on iTunes, talk to your friends about us, and share the links. And it'd also be great if you could take a survey from our new network, Wondery, at wondery.com/survey.
For advice or support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0207 840 8960 or go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter, safety or counselling, call the Genesis 24-hour hotline 214-946-4357 or go on the website www.genesisshelter.org, or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 800 799 7233.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan, engineered by Jacob Moose Molin. Music is composed and performed by Simba Sumba. Logo art by Rob Cohen. Real Crime Profile is produced and recorded at Empire Studios LA by XG Productions. Real Crime Profile is distributed by Wondery.